He honore, he karoria, he maongarongo ki te atua, ki te atua. Nō reira, e te kaitiaki koutou katoa o ngā taonga tātou katoa. E mihi koutou I tēnei pō. Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill towards all people. These were the words our Māori people heard in 1814, way up in the place called Rangi Aua, spoken by the Reverend Samuel Marsden, trying to convert us Māori to Christianity. It sort of worked.
Welcome, everybody, to the 82nd. Anybody here for the first one? No? Good. 82nd Annual Thomas Cawthron Memorial Lecture. It's my pleasure to be the MC for tonight. My name is Lise Seymour. I'm the Chairman of the Cawthron Board. I'd like to welcome our Chairman of the Trust Board, Mr. John Palmer, to come up and open up proceedings. Thank you, John.
Good evening, everybody. This is an amazing site. In 82 years, we think this may be the largest Cawthron lecture audience ever. I don't have the data to prove that, but I'm convinced that, firstly, it's a magnificent turnout. What I can say is that good science is what Cawthron is all about. We are looking to our future to say, given the uncertainties in science reforms that Sir Peter will touch on, how do we manage our way through that? And one of my messages to you is, if you enjoy this evening and you've come as volunteers because you think it will be worthwhile, spread the message. It's important that we understand the value of Cawthron in this community, both as an employer, as an opportunity for young people, if they're properly qualified, to have interesting, productive and rewarding lives living and working here in Nelson in a professional environment. You can help spread that message wherever you can, and our job is to make sure that we are open to telling people what's going on, telling people what we are doing and why it's important, but understanding always that unless we can have a business framework that allows us financially to survive, we can't do any of that.
So now we'll move on to Sir Peter Gluckman. So I think a lot of you will already know Sir Peter Gluckman or know of Sir Peter Gluckman, so he doesn't really need an introduction. However, when I read through the introduction that I have here, I felt that it was really, really important to stress and lay out the credentials, the history, and the work that Peter has done. Sir Peter has done. So just bear with me. So Sir Peter Gluckman is the president of the International Science Council. It sounds like a pretty big gig to me. He's also a director and trustee of COI2, which is the Centre for Informed Futures, and distinguished professor emeritus at the University of Auckland. Between 2009 and 2018, he was the first New Zealand Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor. He leads work on factors affecting social cohesion and society and how societies respond to new technologies, and chairs the New Zealand government's reviews of universities and the science system, which is playing out now. He has received numerous honours, including the Rutherford Medal, and was made a Knight of the New Zealand Order of Merit in 2009. So please join with me in welcoming Sir Peter Gluckman to the stage.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to let you all down because I'm not sure what I'm going to say that's going to entertain you for a while, but I'll try my best. I gave the Cawthron lecture here, I think, 20 years ago, last time, Nick. I think, like, damned if I can remember what it's about. It shows how old I am. Can anybody hear of me what I spoke about? No, okay, then we're fine. I can talk again. Anyhow, so I'll repeat myself. Anyhow, the Cawthron Institute is a remarkable and critical part of New Zealand's science infrastructure. And I'll probably say a little bit more about that later on in my talk. But I think its role in both this town, but more importantly in understanding New Zealand's aquatic and marine ecosystem should not be underestimated. And even though we're going through some difficult times, which I'll talk a lot about in a moment, I think the future of New Zealand as an ocean economy and an ocean environmental guardian depends in no small part on the health of the Cawthron Institute. And I really think it's quite a remarkable institution. So I'm going to talk about a number of things, but before I do, let me just illustrate a couple of the hats that I wear. First of all, as Lee's pointed out, I head what's called Koitu, the Centre for Informed Futures, which was incubated in the University of Auckland, but is now an independent think tank. When I left the role as Chief Science Advisor to the Prime Ministers of New Zealand, the head of DPMC, Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, suggested that what I did in terms of long-term thinking across multiple domains of policy formation needed to be sustained, and he suggested that we should set up a think tank which was non-partisan and focused only on long-term issues. And so that's what we've done. We have this small think tank in Auckland, which is a charitable trust with a number of university, national and global members and partners that focuses on trying to understand how an evidence-informed approach can be used to think about long-term policy thinking for New Zealand, not something that we're very good at doing as a nation. Our major themes are shown on this slide, and I won't dwell on it in any length, except I think, given that we're at Cawthron, to point out that I particularly like this map to point out that New Zealand is actually a small island in a very large marine estate. But a lot of what we do, as Lise has already mentioned, is think about how we live with change, how we live with technological change, environmental change, geostrategic change, which is more than Donald Trump, but we'll come back to that in a moment, and a lot about how we should improve public policy formation in New Zealand for the long term. We're not very good, because of our political system, in long-term thinking, and we tend to fall back into transactional politics very easily. The second hat I wear is as President of the International Science Council, which is based in Paris, which represents all the scientific organisations of the world effectively, particularly with the UN system. The New Zealand member is the Royal Society Te Aparangi, the Royal Society of New Zealand. There's academies, young academies, funders, interdisciplinary bodies and so forth. It's very non-political. It's, I think, the only organisation in the world where the People's Republic of China and Taiwan actually share a vote and have done so for a long time and are happy to continue doing so. We have office in Paris, as well as offices in the various parts of the world, and you can see what we do on this slide. You probably never heard of it, because most of our work is done through a variety of bodies, many of which are very relevant to what we're talking about here, many of which are now in awful compromise given the events of the last few months. So a number of international scientific committees you will have heard of, the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, which is currently headed by a New Zealander, the World Climate Research Programme, which is currently chaired by a New Zealander, the Global Ocean Observatory System, which is very relevant to here, Future Earth, which is the major body that coordinates sustainability research, and so forth. And so there's a lot of activities either trying to coordinate international science or deal with the UN system and all its agencies over scientific aspects. 2015, just a decade ago, was a very positive time. We were in a period of relative geopolitical calm. Globalization was working very well. There was a relatively positive mindset out there, And we achieved 3 major agreements in that year. The Sustainable Development Goals were launched. The Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is a very scientifically based agreement, and the Paris Climate Change Agreement was reached. It really was the peak of and all of these are strongly scientifically based, and all of these were enthusiastically agreed to by every country on the planet. 10 years later, where are we? We've had a pandemic, about which a little bit more later. The United States didn't even agree to the new pandemic treaty, which was negotiated last month. We all understand the threats to the lack of progress on the sustainability agenda. I'm particularly worried around the world about the issues of youth mental health in particular, and cohesion. Conflict is growing, failure of nationalism. How do we live with technology? And a particular issue we'll come back to in a moment, there's been a decline, particularly in the so-called liberal democracies, in trust in the elites of society, and in particular governments, politicians, media, academia and science, all caught up in this, and we'll come back to that in a moment. And if you just look at the Global Sustainability Development Report, which is the progress report on the SDGs, you don't even have to look at the things. All you see on the right, and this is a scientifically led assessment, is that virtually no green there. It's all red and orange. We're failing on virtually every aspect of the Sustainable Development Goals. 10 years ago, we were in a positive mindset about where we were progressing as a planet. Now, I don't think we can say we're in a positive mindset. So let's just dissect it out from the scientific point of view. And first of all, I think it's useful just to start with what is science. Actually, it's not so easy to answer. I remember when I became president of the International Science Council, what am I president of? What is science? Because people have their own views of what science is. Is it just stuff done in the lab? Is social science science? Is history science? What are the boundaries of what is science? But the important thing is, it may be the only knowledge system that's truly universal. Modern science is universal, whether you're in Mali or Chad or China or New Zealand or Vanuatu or anywhere else. When you talk about modern science, they know what you're talking about. It's universal. It's an organised system of knowledge. You can read these slides as well as I can read them, based on theory, observation, and experiment. Explanations cannot be based on belief or tradition. And it doesn't matter whether we're looking at the most microscopic scale or the scale that the Webb telescope looks at. We're basing it on observation, theory, and experiment. And it's always subject to expert critique, contestation. Knowledge which is not subject to critique and contestation is not science. That's why science needs to be published. And thus knowledge evolves. But we've got to be honest and accept there are many issues that science cannot address. And I think one of the issues that has happened in the last 30 years, and we'll come back to it, is sometimes scientists have claimed they can answer everything when they cannot. But while science is universal, the way science operates is not universal. Science operates in different countries, in different situations, with different cultures in different ways. And the issues that we've had in New Zealand as elsewhere, is how does knowledge science relate to other knowledge systems? You can't blend knowledge systems. That doesn't make sense. But we need to understand that all of us live with multiple knowledge systems. We live with, and we work our way through them for ourselves. It's not that the science is the only knowledge system that's there. And that's why I've always been adamant in my roles, and I had a role as a former president setting up the International Network of Government Science Advice, that science alone never determines action. Science must be a key part of informing decision-making by decision makers, whether you're an individual or a prime minister, but you need to take into account these other dimensions. And the choice of science is always contextual within the science in which it operates. So we come to the issue now of trust in science. As I've already said, trust in institutions has declined in democracies over the last 2 decades, and I've written a lot about why that might be the case. We've seen the decline in trust in governments and politicians, particularly in the media, and I'll show you the data in a moment, police and so forth. And science is an institution, and to some extent it may have been affected by this general decline. But having said that, science is still far more trusted than any other institution in society. But unfortunately, rejection of science has become a bit of a political badge. And we've seen that particularly in North America and the United States, with populists rejecting science, not because they don't believe in science. In fact, there's a lot of evidence from from researchers showing that most populists actually do believe in the science, but it's useful to reject it as a political badge, and we could talk about that later perhaps. We've seen polarisation within societies, in no small part due to social media, but not the only reason. And populism has always defined science as a part of the so-called deep state. Now, what does that mean? It says that they see science as making decisions on things when they should have an equal right to make that decision. It means that they think that science is somehow producing truth. And notice I never use the word truth when I talk about science. So, when they have their own version of truth, which are equally valid. And that's a very hard thing for science to deal with, is this rise in populism. Alongside that, we've seen the selective distrust in science is linked to specific issues. Climate change. If you have interests on the right, let's say in the oil or gas industry, you may not like climate change. And so you reject the science of climate change, rather than saying, it's inconvenient, but I must understand it and work out how to deal with it. Equally, we've seen it over vaccinations and spades during the COVID era, and we've seen it over genetic technologies. And that debate still continues in New Zealand. What is perhaps less, it might be surprising for some of you, is the fact the evidence doesn't suggest that disinformation is very important. All disinformation does is you identify it as disinformation if you don't agree with it, and you accept it if you do agree with what they're saying. There's not much evidence that the so-called disinformation pandemic is actually changing people's minds. That's different to the propaganda that can be put out in newspapers and so forth. And then we have issues within science itself that can undermine trust in our profession. How many times have you seen scientists in the newspaper overstate what they've done or claim they've cured cancer, diabetes, or something else? I had a professor when I was dean of the medical school who claimed he cured diabetes 4 times, and each time it was a different cure. At some point, you end up with a skepticism that undermines trust in science. I won't dwell on it now, but the whole business of how the scientific enterprise is now incentivised, with how many papers you've published and what journal you've published, etc., makes science work in a way that is too internalised, rather than remembering that science is there to serve the country, the people, the society. And sometimes I think scientists have forgotten that they, particularly public scientists, that they're funded by the taxpayer, by the Crown, and that they don't have an entitlement. They must earn the respect, the rights to do what they do. And we could talk about how too many of us can be patronising in the way we talk. Now, I'm not going to talk at length about this particular thing. the COVID virus. I'm sure you're all sick of it. But I think if you think about what happened in COVID globally, it exacerbated the issues I've been talking about. It exacerbated polarisation. It exacerbated populism. It changed the behaviour of scientists, making some of them into heroes and some of them into enemies. It did a lot of things that were very problematic. And it's left people a bit more scared. It's left people economies in some issue, a matter we're going to come back to in a moment. And overall, I think this has been an enormous catalyst to undermine how science can contribute best to society. You can see that in the way in which the reduction in international science funding, which has happened in the last 12 months from the United States, but before that from countries in Europe, traditional major funders of research, as a result directly of the thrust of polarisation and populism which COVID fueled. So we need to rebuild trust in science. Science can be resisted, but at the end of the day, trust is a relationship. If you don't, it's a two-way relationship, and I think science too often forgets that. We must remember that science will only be used well by society when society trusts it, and how we communicate that needs to change. First of all, modern science is seen too often as an elite undertaking. It's too hard to understand. It's elite. It's not a natural behaviour to do what scientists do, to question each other, to replicate experiments, to self-criticise what's the problem with why the experiment didn't work. It's a very abstract system, and the psychology of how we trust people finds it hard in general when systems are very abstract. Because of that, science is always at risk of becoming more remote from society than it needs to. And science is always producing inconvenient truths, with the fact that climate change is happening, and we need to do something about methane production, or whether with the fact that we could use genetic technologies to improve food production and health, or eradicate unwanted pests, or so forth. They're facts, and they immediately confront people's biases and values, and that's a point of contestation. And how we handle that when we're talking in very different ways to each other is very difficult. I've already talked about the problems of populism, but we also need to think that for the last 30 years, the postmodernist discourse has tended to take a rather relativistic view to the role of science. What worries me most is the way we communicate. Science communicates. We still communicate in a deficit model, in a patronising model. Robert Merton, who was a great sociologist of science in 1942, described scientists as if they were priests standing at the altar preaching truth to an uninformed, naive community. Now, I hope that's long gone, but in fact, a number of too many scientists still act in that way. And I think we've got a long way to go. Not every scientist can be a communicator, nor should they be. But we do need to build up the strengths that are needed for science to be properly communicated and understood in ways that are relevant to communities, so that science can be a tool that communities can use. And this has been repeatedly said by people much wiser than me, like Jane Lubchenco, who some of those in Cawthron will know as a very famous scientist from North America, that we need to avoid hubris, to be trusted. We need respect for other knowledge systems, and we haven't always done that. And we need fundamental new approaches to science communication. So with that rather lengthy introduction, I want to turn to this particular country, New Zealand. And here's the data from the last Edelman survey. And it shows on the blue, New Zealand, trust in New Zealand as a percentage of the population, and in black, the global, so-called global assessment. And you can see that on the left, teachers and scientists are by far the most trusted people within New Zealand society, compared to your neighbours even, to your CEO, sorry Volker, to citizens in our country, to CEOs, government leaders and journalists. And in fact, the frightening thing about media is New Zealand has one of the lowest trusts in media of any country in the world. It's actually lower than in the United States or in Europe. Very low. And there's something there that needs to be reflected on, and I can't explain that. But it's very interesting. Scientists, along with teachers, are the most trusted people in our community. I won't go further on that at the moment. The other thing is, what do New Zealanders feel about scientists playing an active role in society and in policy making? Again, this comes from another survey, and again it shows very much that New Zealanders should both work closely with politicians to integrate scientific results into policy making. About 60% of New Zealanders think that's the case. They should advocate for specific policies, communicate to policymakers, but most of all, we should communicate better to the public. Now, I actually would have hoped that they would have said that scientists should work much more closely with politicians to bring science into policy making. Certainly that's what I believe, and I hope that we need that to try and make sure that evidence does inform policy greatly. And one of the great things that pleased me in the last few weeks is the appointment of John Roche, shown here, as the country's third chief science advisor. My other role I've had for the last 15 months has been chairing these two reviews for the government. One on the science and innovation system and one on the university system. Now, unfortunately, I'd love to share everything that we said with you, but while the final reports have been handed to the minister about 6 weeks ago, I would be shot, killed, hung, drawn, quartered, which some people would like to do to me anyhow, if I release those reports. But I think that what I can say is the interim report was released, some actions have been followed that have at least followed the general theme of those reports, and I want to pick up on those bits that I can talk about. When I talk about science, I often think about a hydroelectric station. You've got to have water coming down, and I regard that as what discovery science is, new ideas coming down. You need a turbine that's going to turn that into knowledge that is applicable, and that's the technology transfer process. You then need power lines that will convert that into something. It will take that and deliver it to the customer, which is the business. And so we've had a lot of discussion in recent times about the turbines and the power lines, but not a lot of enough discussion about the water. So what I want to do is focus more upstream on the water, that which drives what we did. And one of the biggest problems I have to say, and I'm scared to show this next slide in this audience, did Rutherford really say this? We haven't the money, so we have to think. It's been quoted by several ministers when they've been challenged about science that he said this. I can find no evidence in the literature anywhere that he did ever say it. And if he did, he's wrong. Because you need money to employ scientists. Scientists need tools, not toys. And if you go to the Cawthron Institute, you'll see very large, expensive toys and tools which need to be supported, and there's a large infrastructure, and so you cannot do it all just with your brains. You can do mathematics maybe with a pen, but ultimately you need a supercomputer. And this quote has been quite harmful in my mind to how we think about New Zealand. Rutherford certainly had instruments when he was at the Cavendish lab in Cambridge. And this, to my mind, is almost says it all. In 1970, we had very similar GDP to Denmark. They had an agricultural base to their economy, which was almost identical to New Zealand. And this is just expressing it in GDP per hour worked, in other words, correcting it for the workforce, and in terms of a constant purchasing power dollar. And you can see, irrespective of whether it's been a left-wing or a right-wing government, I'm not sure we ever had one or the other, that's somewhere in the centre, you can see that we've just progressively and linearly diverged from the OECD average, from Denmark, as an example of a small advanced economy, and Australia. You can't hide the fact that this has been New Zealand exceptionalism at its worst. Just diverting and diverting and diverting. And while there may be many other factors involved, the one factor that comes through consistently is our failure to recognise that R&D are critical to a journey on a path towards greater productivity. And this is the hard numbers. Just look at the right-hand column. This is the GDP per capita in nominal US dollars, adjusted for the purchasing power, which is the way OECD does it to make things comparable. So $1 would buy a tenth of a hamburger in any country, or $10 would buy a hamburger, I guess. Corrected here, and this is from our first report to the government, you can see that New Zealand is at the bottom of the pile, right at the bottom. Australia, 1.5 times so much per head. Singapore, 3.7 times per head. Denmark, 2.8 times a head. Austria, 3 times a head. I could go on and on and on, but this has been a consistent pattern over 20 years or so. And at some point, if you don't invest, you end up poorer than people who do invest. And that's the basic, simple fact. And if you go on and look at this in more detail, and I won't bore you with all the numbers, if you just look at the relationship between public sector spend, here's little New Zealand somewhere, there's the button thing here, there's New Zealand in the green, you can see the countries that have both the highest business expenditure are also the countries that have the highest public expenditure, because they're related. Clearly, businesses will invest where the public sector invests in science, and you can see there's almost a linear relationship starting at about where New Zealand is now, at about 0.6% GDP. You can see what would happen if we got up to these small countries in red, where we got our expenditure up to where all the other small countries we would like to be compared to are sitting up here, but we're way down here. No wonder our business expenditure is relatively low. And then if we look at it another way, our relationship between our own expenditure, total, between public and private sector, you can see that, and related to our gross domestic product per capita, you can see again New Zealand sits way down there at the, so I'm pressing buttons now, doing things they shouldn't be doing. Way down there, again compared to all these countries up the other end, with the exception of the United States, Switzerland, Israel, Korea, Sweden, Austria, Denmark, Singapore, Norway, Iceland, Finland, and other countries we should be comparing ourselves to. And you can sit there and do the sums and realise if we even increased our expenditure by 0.2% of GDP, the magnified effect it would have on our nation's productivity, not overnight, and that's the problem. The investment in R&D takes time to have its return. We would get the growth that the government desperately wants. So The frustration I have is it's self-evident to every significant economist around the world that growth in a country's economy doesn't depend ultimately on investment in education and investment in R&D. But we keep on delaying it. I can't think how many years, whether it's from the Labour-led government or National-led government, the statement's always been, we'll invest more in R&D when economic conditions allow, which means it's never there because we've always got something else that the short-term expenditure on a 3-year political cycle requires. So a lot of our 2 reports is focused on this issue, that at some point the country needs to invest more in R&D. And so we started to dissect it out from 2 points of view. One is, what are the basis on which public sector funding of R&D should occur? And it seemed very simple to us. First of all, it must be excellent. Second-rate research is a waste of money. It doesn't advance the knowledge base of the country or society. So it must be of quality. And that can only be judged by scientists. But then, in a small country, we're only 5 million people. We can't do everything. So we've got to be clear about why we do things in New Zealand. And there are many reasons. It could be because we're going to get somebody the Nobel Prize, or it could be because there's a particular issue that New Zealand must address. But I think every scientist should be able to address 2 issues. Why do it in New Zealand? And if it's taking the public purse rather than the private purse, they should be able to justify why the Crown should fund it. It sounds it's asking a lot, but when I used to get grants from the National Institutes of Health in the US, I always had to justify why the American taxpayer would fund research in New Zealand, why it couldn't be done in the States, why it should be done here. This is not an unrealistic thing to ask. But then we focus more from the public policy point of view of what kind of research should be done. And we recognise that instead of talking about research in the traditional way, you have basic research, then a bit of or discovery research and applied research and then development, we should actually put it into the minds of what a policy maker thinks science is about. And that's what I spend a little bit of time on. So the first kind of research that we talked about, we called stewardship research. This is the research necessary that the Crown must support to protect our people, culture, environment, reputation, finance system, etc., etc., etc. And you can see it there. There's a long list of things that matter, from collecting that boring but essential data we need on which to understand our people or environment, to protecting the natural collections which are necessary to understand biosecurity and other things, to conservation of our biota, our cultural, historical aspects, our environmental aspects, biosecurity, cybersecurity, defence-related. It's all part of protecting our natural assets. And in fact, the Crown spends a lot of money on these things, not usually through MB, not through the contestable funding system, but through MPI and through DOC and through MFE and through Social Investment Agency and health and so forth. But what we think it needs to be done is there's some curation needed to improve the quality of how that's done. Secondly, we need research to support public policy. It's not quite the same thing. We need operational research to improve our health system, to improve our education system. We're not very good at our operational research. If you're in a big company, you might spend, 1 to 2% of your expenditure on operational research in a large service company. We wouldn't do that in the health system here. When I chaired a committee for government a few years ago looking at health research, health expenditure on operational research, we could only identify about $50 million of research out of a $15 billion industry. That's nowhere near what a company of that size would spend on operational research. Operational research is essential. We need it in a lot of service sectors. In the social sector, the Integrated Data Initiative, the Social Investment Agency, the Census, are all about trying to improve public policy, to help public policy development. And then we have specific policy issues. And the most obvious one is methane production. New Zealand is spending disproportionately a large amount of money on reducing methane production from cows. That's a policy demand. It may have other benefits, but at the end of it, here is a situation where, starting with the key government and continuing onwards, the government has disproportionately put money into climate change research to meet the policy needs of how we meet our international obligations while maintaining our economic growth. Now, I'm going to jump over one of the four categories, the last one, productivity and exploitation, because this is where a lot is happening. The private sector is responding well in New Zealand. So on one hand, we have something like Agri-Zero, which is a rather unique public-private partnership to try and reduce methane production from agriculture, of which the private sector is by far the largest investor, but the public sector's come on board, and it in turn invests in lots of startup companies. Then there's lots of startup companies. I apologise to anybody from this part of the world, but this is just a section of the companies that University of Auckland has started up in the last few years. University of Auckland has produced about 50% of the university-associated startups in New Zealand since it's been recorded. Then you've got Rocket Lab. Everybody knows about Rocket Lab. But the story I want to celebrate is actually the one on the top right. This is Fadi Mashriki. People don't know that Apple has its third largest research centre in the world in New Zealand, in Auckland. If you've got an iPhone and it's charged by wireless, that was developed here. If you've got an iPad with a pen, and that's how the pen gets charged, that was developed here. And that happened because 30 years ago, an engineer in Auckland called John Boyes discovered the whole idea of induction technology, of using the way you can without wires, you can charge across a gap. He thought it was going to be used in heavy industry, and it went nowhere. Then one of his students said, well, we might be able to use it in small-scale things. And it was spun out as a company which you may have heard of called Power by Proxy. Power by Proxy nearly went under, and then it was rescued by Fadi Mashriki, who developed all the things I've talked about. Apple heard about it and said they had to buy the company, and Apple bought the company. But Fadi refused to leave New Zealand. He said, no, I'm staying in New Zealand. So Apple said, well, we need the company, so we'll invest in you in Auckland. And so now we have a very large, significant enterprise in New Zealand based on New Zealand discovered technology, developed to a certain level by New Zealand, bought by offshore, but because New Zealand had other assets, and particularly the CEO did not want to leave New Zealand, the company stayed in New Zealand. If you look at Singapore, you look at Israel, that's been where they've been so good. But what do we tend to do? We tend to say, oh, we can't have big multinationals coming into New Zealand. There's quite a xenophobic reaction to multinationals coming in here. But that's the way we will get the kind of growth that we need. Now I want to come back to the river, the fourth use of science, to produce new knowledge. No developed country, in my view, can remain a developed country without a commitment to producing new knowledge in a variety of new domains. New Zealand's had a proud history. I mean, we're not very good at writing about the history of science in New Zealand, but there's been a remarkable number of developments over the last 150 years in New Zealand in science. But we're now at risk because our investment, particularly in a technologically intense world, has got less and less. And if you don't have water coming into the dam, you won't have any electricity out the end in due course once the dam is dry. And I want to talk a bit about discovery science, which may or may not have an end user when it starts. This is Michael Faraday on the left, so-called discoverer of electricity, and Disraeli on the right. The story goes that Disraeli went to see Faraday, who was then giving exhibitions at the Royal Institution in London, and Disraeli saw whatever he was doing with his mate Sparks and electricity, and Disraeli asked him, "What use is it?" And Faraday answered, "I don't know, but one day you will tax it." And that's the point about discovery science. A lot of discovery science is not known. I'm going to rush very quickly through the next few slides. I'm going to tell you about my 10-year fixation, but you might argue that it's a 50-year fixation about useless knowledge. Before I go there, I just need to explain a bit of biology to you. So in our bottom of our brain, we have an organ called the hypothalamus, which makes little peptides, little amino acid short molecules that tell the pituitary gland, which is at the base of the gland, to make hormones. And the hormone I was interested in, still interested in, is growth hormone, the hormone that makes children grow. And we know that growth hormone works by making the liver and other tissues make a hormone called IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1. And that's the system that I focused on. In fact, when I started my master's degree, IGF-1 wasn't known, and it was called something else, and most of my master's was trying to work out how to measure the so-called hormone, which nobody had a name for. But let's get beyond that. I was fascinated in 1972 by observations by Selna Kaplan and San Francisco, person I later went to work with for many years, for the fact when you measured the levels of hormone in fetal blood, they were very high, yet we knew that growth hormone didn't make fetuses grow. Children who are born without growth hormone of normal size at birth. But the levels fell very quickly at birth. What the hell was going on? And I spent 10 years of my life trying to understand was just due to the fact that the brain was immature and not regulating the release of growth hormone by the fetal pituitary gland properly, or something else was going on. I did a lot of my work in sheep, and you can see here, this pointer's not working, so I'm just going to go up here. I'll have to take my microphone with me. And you can see that it falls very rapidly at birth. And that fascinated me. I still don't know, 40 years on, exactly what was going on. I have my ideas, but I haven't completely proven them. But was it useless knowledge? I spent years and years studying why the hell's growth hormone so high in the fetus. And I still can't tell you completely. But it had some applications. First of all, it allowed us to understand, because everybody had assumed that growth hormones regulating fetal growth, and we showed it wasn't, we actually showed that IGF-1, which is normally regulated by growth hormone after you're born, was still the main controller of growth before birth. That was my master's thesis. First to show that IGF-1 was the fetal growth factor. And we showed how it was regulated by maternal nutrition and fetal insulin release. We're going to show a lot more about IGF-1. I'm going to come back to it in a moment. But that basic understanding of what regulates our growth in the first 9 months of life depended on understanding why growth hormone was not regulating growth in the first 9 months of life. And we actually went on to show that every hormone needs a receptor. It's like a key needs a lock, and the receptor wasn't there in the fetus, in the fetal tissues. So that's why the growth hormone did not work. The second thing that it led was, it was 1988, a colleague of mine, now dead, David Barker, was one of a group that showed that babies who were born low birth weight, 70 years later developed diabetes, type 2 diabetes. heart disease and strokes. It was highly controversial at the time, and so the epidemiologists who were in the UK came to me because of the work that we had done on fetal growth and asked us if we could show that this was real. So we went first to sheep, and you can see we can turn we can turn rats into couch potatoes quite easily by undernourishing the utero and then feeding them up after birth, and you can turn them into beautiful couch potatoes. In 1997, we went on to study children who had been born small, and were the first to show that this was prospectively, indeed by the age of 7, they already had insulin resistance. They were on the prodrome to getting diabetes. And then we asked a question which is one that we don't too often ask enough of in science. Yes, we had made the observation, but more importantly, why was this the case? And this led to a paper which I'm not going to dwell on at length, but those of you who are scientists will know that publishing in science is not a trivial exercise. And we were able to show that this was due to what we were talking about at Cawthron this morning, adaptive developmental plasticity. This was the first example in humans that adaptive developmental plasticity really exists, and which is the fact that the fetus can predict its future from signals that it gets from its mother, and it will change its biology according to that. So if you think you're going to live in an undernourished world, which is the signal coming from because your mother's placenta is not working properly, you change your biology to be like a camel. When you can get fatty foods, you'll lay down extra fat for a bad time. Of course, they're not born into an undernourished world. They're born into a well-nourished world, and so they go and get fat. Now, again, without going into details, we were later to prove this absolutely by going to Jamaica and studying children who have been born with, who got the various forms of childhood malnutrition, and shown exactly that this was entirely the different types of infant malnutrition could be related to this particular formation. And this led to a whole lot of other work. It led to the whole concept that adaptive development plasticity, how we operate in early life, is not just a phenomenon. Was it a seaweed we were looking at this morning, or or fish this morning, but it's a phenomenon in humans too. And we developed what became the first real understanding of how to apply evolutionary biology to medicine, and a whole lot of books here that I won't dwell on here. But did this matter? Well, it did, because in 2011, the United Nations General Assembly had a special General Assembly about non-communicable disease, and this is the clause that got written into it, which is directly related, because I wrote this clause, so I know how it's related. John Key allowed me to be part of the delegation to work on this, to actually show, going from very basic science to actually getting a declaration in the UN as to the role of poor maternal state on diabetes, and also the effects of gestational diabetes, another story. But that wasn't all. Is it only true about metabolism, diabetes? And so we went on and thought, could it also apply the same kind of phenomenon apply to mental health? And again, I'm cutting the story very short, but we were able to show that maternal stress in pregnancy and maternal stress soon after birth changed the baby's brain using MRI and other techniques, and that went on to make these children more sensitive to emotional problems in adolescence. And you can see here that if we looked at all the factors that are involved, early childhood brain development is one of the major factors in driving youth mental health. And just 2 weeks ago, just to show that I'm not entirely I managed to get a paper into Science again, pointing at which was accepted, highlighting the evolutionary origins that lead to this particular relationship between maternal mental health and development of anxiety in younger people. Again, Sounds like a long way from understanding growth hormone in the fetus, but directly linked in my mind to the thinking that went on. But there's one last one. When I was thinking about why that precipitous fall happened at birth in growth hormone, one of the things I was thinking about is, could it be the temperature? The temperature of the fetus in utero is about 0.5 degree to 1 degree warmer than it is for us. So they have a body temperature of about 39 degrees compared to 37.5 for us. And so we went on to experiment to see whether that brain cooling, whether that cooling at birth could be protective against brain injury. Because at birth, a number of babies, particularly in the developing world, have brain injury due to a lack of oxygen at birth. And could it be, because every baby suffers some lack of oxygen at birth, that cooling could be neuroprotective? There's a logic in that thinking which, if you think it through, is there. And it led us to a trial of using selective head cooling with mild brain cooling after neonatal brain injury in a 28-centre trial around the world, Auckland, London, and then the rest were North America, the most difficult trial anything I've ever had to do. But this was the first study to show that brain cooling was neuroprotective. It reduced the incidence of cerebral palsy quite significantly. And this is now still, 20 years later, the standard of care in every neonatal unit around the world. Done in different ways, but it was from this study that it was done. So again, came from understanding this useless bit of science about growth hormone in fetus. And because we had already got involved in brain injury work, and I knew a bit about IGF-1, we started to say, we make IGF-1 when we have a wound in our skin. Do we make IGF-1 in our brain when it's injured? And so we started to study IGF-1 in the brain, and we were able to show both infant and adult brain that it made IGF-1 when injured. We went on to show that if you gave IGF-1 to the brain soon after an injury, it was protective. But we showed that this large protein of about 71 amino acids had to have the 3 amino acids at one end cut off to be active. But then we found that the 3 amino acids that had been cut off was in fact neuroprotective. But it's unstable. So Margaret Brimble, who Cawthron Institute knows well, helped me make a stable form of it, and we showed it was neuroprotective. But we also showed that the degradation product of the tripeptide was neuroprotective. That's called NZ2566. And it was commercialised in 2001 as New Zealand's first publicly listed university spin-out. Unfortunately, universities weren't good at knowing how to do that then, so it may have made other people rich in time, but it didn't make me rich. But now, 20 years later, in 2023, the first drug, which we invented, Margaret and I invented, is now licensed by the FDA, and the second drug is in clinical development. Neuron Pharmaceuticals, of which I have no stake in any longer, now has a market cap of about $1.8 billion based in Australia and the US. Now that all came out of a bit of useless science in New Zealand. I know it sounds like a long string to bow, pull to bow, but that is the case. If I hadn't been doing that useless work on growth hormone in the first place, I would not have ended up here. And I think, I'm not trying to be immodest here, I think it's fair to say at least 4 or 5 distinct applications have come over 30 years from one bit of useless science. So I'm going to wrap up in a minute. We've got to think about our future. The economy of the future is undoubtedly based on AI, quantum, advanced genetic technologies like gene editing, synthetic biology. And it's also true that science, technology, economics, and geostrategic interests are more intertwined than ever before. And we also got to accept that being only 5 million people, we cannot do everything, and in particularly we won't do everything on our own. We're perhaps already a decade behind most of our comparator countries in some of our technology uses, and AI certainly, and GE probably 20 years behind. But the biggest impact on our on our productivity in both the public and private sector will probably come from these technologies. But the biggest issue is social license. We've seen that over GE, and we may yet see it over AI, and we need to think more about that carefully. This slide worries me enormously from the Edelman survey. It shows that New Zealanders, in blue, compared to the global, reject the innovation of AI significantly compared to other countries. We're about the same around GM, maybe a little bit more over. Even low embracement of gene-based medicines even. Extraordinary. We need to think this through. Is this just because we're somewhat Luddite? I don't think so. Or is it more likely because of this? The quality of science education. And I just want you to point to this thing I picked up when I was in Beijing a few weeks ago. Every primary school in China must have at least one science teacher with a master's degree in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. School must appoint at least one vice principal for science. Science education is being incorporated into after-school activities. Think about what's happening in China and compare that to our education system and reflect. We've produced 3 Nobel laureates from New Zealand. Sadly, none of them did any of their research in New Zealand. We need to produce another 3, but they need to do their research in New Zealand. And that should be where we're looking. That's Wilkins, Rutherford, and McDiarmid on the right, for those who don't recognise them. Many people don't realise that Maurice Wilkins got the Nobel Prize for being one of the discoverers of DNA, along with Crick and Watson. Of course, Rosalind Franklin should have got it, but she'd unfortunately died. So in summary, what I'm trying to do is say science is critical for all our futures. There's not one problem that our society or the world faces where science cannot help. It has multiple purposes, which we've talked about, and addresses issues from local to global, as was pointed out in the introduction to me. But we've got to start thinking about it as an investment in growing New Zealand and a cost. And that won't happen unless every one of you in this room supports an investment, because investments take time and governments respond to what publics want. Scientists have screamed and yelled for a long time, the system is in trouble. But priorities always go to where the public seems to want to go, which are the short-term issues. But if we're going to grow our way out of this, and the government stated that investment in science and innovation is one of its 5 growth priorities, then we need to do something about it. Unfortunately, in New Zealand, the private sector has been remarkably silent about the need for public investment in R&D. The public has been relatively silent about it. I think this is a time when we do need, given the challenges that the world faces, for us to have a different view of that. Thank you very much.
Well, I can say as well, wasn't that a fantastic presentation? So I'm now going to move to Dr. Kate Hudson. Dr. Kate Hudson leads the aquatic animal health team at Cawthron as an adjunct associate professor at James Cook University across the ditch in Australia. She was raised by zoologist parents who instilled a lifelong curiosity about nature, biodiversity, and animal behaviour. She founded the Marine Parasitology Laboratory at James Cook University, where she led research in fish parasitology, coral disease ecology, and disease management in aquaculture. She joined Cawthron in 2019 and championed the build of New Zealand's first dedicated aquatic biocontainment facility to advance research on aquatic pests and diseases. Kate contributes to national biosecurity, including the development of import health standard regulations and marine disease surveillance. She lives in Tasmania, so she is the person that runs our Tasmanian office. And I'd like you all to put your hands together to welcome Kate Hudson to the podium.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. We're all here tonight because Thomas Cawthron had a vision for the role of science in society. And his legacy is more than 100 years of science in agriculture, in forestry, and now in freshwater and marine science. And that has been available to the people of Nelson, to Aotearoa New Zealand, and the world. This is a famous stage and a centenary since Ernest Rutherford gave an annual lecture, a man who made extraordinary scientific advances as an experimental scientist in both atomic and nuclear physics. So as Liz gave away, you will obviously hear my Australian accent and know that I originate from the West Island of New Zealand. He also mentioned I was raised by zoologist parents. My dad was a behavioural scientist and my mum a science teacher. And I thought our family was normal and everyone else's was a bit weird. And when I was a little girl, my mum brought a microscope home from school. What were we going to look at? So she reached into my hair, pulled out a head louse, and showed it to my sister and I underneath the microscope. It was absolutely horrifying. All those claws, all those little hairs. I was absolutely fascinated. And my mum leapt into action. She meticulously combed out the lice from my hair and my sister, and also removed the nits, which is the egg stage that the lice cement onto your hair. We were doused in nit lotion. The bed sheets were washed in hot water. And I love this photo because of the expression on my dad's face. It's like we were having fun. And amazingly, Mum became really well known in the community for effective head lice management. And the neighbours used to send their kids over to our place for them to be checked and deloused. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, we observed remarkable behavioural changes in response to an infectious disease threat. So what behaviours did you change? Apart from rushing out to panic buy toilet paper. Who did you trust for information? And who influenced your decisions? I had to sneak a little picture of my dairy goats in here this evening. But they're illustrating tonight why we are seeing an increase in disease outbreaks worldwide. And it's largely due to significant demographic, technological and environmental changes, which we've seen as part of the 21st century. And these changes have created more opportunities for disease spread. We are now more connected to each other than we ever have been before. We're pushing into remote ecosystems, and we're coming into contact and interacting with animals in new ways. This is through animal domestication, wildlife trade, and climate change. So we're changing the way animals interact with other animals and the way we interact with them. I had kidding season in October last year, and my neighbour came over to visit the kids because it's a really exciting time, of course, and she was picking up the kids and she kissed them. And my daughter looked at me horrified because she's obviously well educated in the disease management area and said to me, "Mum, our neighbour doesn't know about scabby mouth disease," which is shared between goats, sheep and humans. Now, I haven't put a picture of scabby mouth disease in my slide deck tonight because it is as horrifying as it sounds. So the UN is now calling highly pathogenic avian influenza, or bird flu, as you may have heard it called, a global zoonotic animal pandemic. It's in wild birds. It's in domestic birds, such as chickens, turkeys, other poultry. It's now been detected in wild mammals, including seals, companion animals, so your dogs and cats, and there have been, and domestic animals as well, such as goats and cattle, dairy cows. And there have been some cases in people. It's not yet in New Zealand. How will we respond to this disease? And what preventative measures can we take now? So I believe the answers, or some of the answers at least, can be found by exploring how wild animals respond to disease. And disease has placed intensive selection pressure on animal populations throughout history. It's why we have evolved immune systems. It's why we have evolved sexual reproduction. And animals have evolved successful strategies to be able to survive from disease. So this evening, I'd like to have a look at some various behaviours and what we might be able to learn from them. And here we can see this snow monkey, which appears to be conducting routine surveillance, checking for lice, seeing whether they're present or absent. And if she finds a louse, she'll do something about it, and she'll probably eat it. However, by doing that, she'll remove the louse and prevent an infestation occurring. So at Cawthron, we're working in partnership with New Zealand King Salmon Company, assisting with their fish health surveillance. In aquaculture, the presence or absence of disease is critically important for fish health and welfare, and also for trade and for prioritising farm management. So our surveillance program involves assessment of fish each month from multiple locations to check for the presence and absence of disease. And what it does is provides industry with an early warning and enables them, if a disease is emerging, and enables them to prioritise health management strategies. Abiotic barriers, such as temperature, salinity, and the air-water interface, enable aquatic animals an opportunity to reduce their pathogens. So scientists have found that jumping behaviour by salmon can be a really effective way of eradicating fish lice. And fishes can also seek out warmer water. This happens typically in guppies, and they move into the warmer water where they can cope with a bit of a warm bath for a while, but their external parasites can't. And that impedes, of course, the pathogen development. It's a behaviour known as behavioural fever. And behavioural fever is a principle that has been used to manage chytrid fungus in frogs. Chytrid fungus, it's a devastating disease that has caused the global collapse of amphibian populations. 90 frog species are now extinct as a consequence of chytrid fungus, and another 124 species have experienced greater than 90% declines in their populations. But some collaborators of mine at University of Melbourne, Monash and University of Auckland came together to find that the fungus thrives in cool conditions and will not grow above 30 degrees. And so frogs that are given access to these shelters or saunas clear their infections faster, and they can actually develop a resistance to future infections. So a few years ago, we took the whānau down to Milford Sound observatory system, underwater observatory in Milford Sound. And my husband, who happens to be a fish biologist, so it's a bit geeky in our household at dinner conversations, but what we observed was this butterfly perch scratching itself on the black coral. And neither of us had never seen anything like this before. And coral polyps are a little bit like jellyfish. They've got stinging cells called nematocysts. So why would this fish voluntarily go up to the coral and scratch itself? And of course, specialising in parasitology, it's got to be about the parasites. And perhaps it was. And that was a hypothesis we put through in a paper we wrote up about it. And about a year later, a paper came out in Ecology about fish and sharks exhibiting this chafing behaviour, and they use other sharks as exfoliants in an attempt to remove parasites and maintain their skin health. And this is really intriguing and appears to be the only global phenomenon where a prey species, not in this case because we've got a shark against a shark, but where a fish will actively approach a predator, a shark, and rub against it. So clearly from these two examples of the black coral and the sharks and the fish chafing, we need really biodiverse environments or ecosystems to enable these behaviours. A loss in biodiversity removes the natural resources that animals need to manage their health. So when we're thinking about animal health more broadly, we need to consider the role of the environment as a resource that provides animals with the opportunity to exhibit natural behaviours that help them manage disease. And we need to protect those biodiverse aquatic environments. So Cawthron's National Seagrass Restoration Research Program, led by Dana Clark, Restore the Meadows, aims to support biodiversity in our marine systems and improve water quality, mitigate climate change, but it may also play a role in enabling organisms to manage disease. Another intriguing behaviour is exhibited by giant trevally in South Africa. They're usually a solitary marine fish, but they come together annually to form these massive aggregations, and they swim up the Matentu River. After travelling for kilometres upstream, they stop and they circle for days, and they're not feeding and they're not breeding. So we hypothesised that these fish are using nature to break the life cycle of parasites that affect them externally. So any skin or gill pathogens would be that cannot survive fresh water would be killed as the fish migrate upstream. But why do they stay there? We propose that a prolonged absence, so the fish are no longer in the marine system, means that any parasite eggs or larvae that are in that system won't be able to find host. It's not there, the giant trevally are gone, and without a host, they will perish and they will die. So when the giant trevally return to the sea, reinfection is substantially reduced. An amazing scenario to have evolved. So we applied a similar principle around breaking parasite life cycles to the management of ectoparasites in aquaculture fish, such as kingfish, and also public aquaria. So an initial treatment, as shown in this diagram, kills parasites that are attached to the gills of this kingfish. And we've got a problem with the eggs and larvae still being present in that confined environment, such as aquaculture or a public aquaria. So we have to time a second treatment after all of the eggs have hatched and all of the larvae have reinfected the fish, but we need to knock them off again or kill them before they reach sexual maturity. So the timing of the treatment after the timing of the second treatment after the first treatment is really critical. And we determined what that timing would be under different environmental scenarios, particularly accounting for temperature. And then all of this was packaged into a website or a mobile app. So I know Lee's told you to put away your phones, but if you feel like playing with the app, feel free to grab it out again. So you can check on benesi.cawthron.org.new Zealand, and you can select the parasite that's currently infecting your fish, and you can say, I'm really organised and I'll treat the fish tomorrow, and the tool will give you a treatment strategy or program for a timed second treatment. So if you do get out your phones tonight and go onto the website, the data scientists tomorrow at Cawthron will say, Kate, the website is so popular overnight. Everyone's using this app. But sitting next to the app is a user manual, and this helps industry or public aquaria to identify any parasites of concern and provides other tips and tricks about biosecurity and quarantine management. And that tool is now being used globally, Singapore, Hawaii, Australia, New Zealand, for biosecurity and parasite identification and management. I only came across this behaviour last year when I was at a conference, and a presenter got up and talked about kelping in whales. And kelping is a behaviour where whales and dolphins interact with seaweed. And it was first observed in 2007, but has since been recorded globally in whales. So scientists first thought that kelping was a form of play, but you're all onto it now. What if it's more than that? Skin exfoliation, parasite removal, potential antibacterial benefits to this behaviour. That got me thinking quite a lot about seaweed. And looking into the literature, yes, again with my husband, the fish biologist, we noticed that many diet studies of piscivorous fishes, that's fish that eat fish, there's usually a small component of algae in their diet. And most fish biologists see a little bit of algae in the stomach of a piscivorous fish and just think it's an artefact or it's anecdotal. But what if it isn't an incidental finding? What if aquatic animals eat seaweed for self-medication? And this behaviour, it's called zoopharmacognosy, is well known in terrestrial animals. You might have seen your cat or dog practising zoopharmacognosy when it's not feeling so well. And this is thought to be a strategy for managing intestinal worms or disease. So we're working with a local commercial fisher, Lindsay Elkington, to investigate whether blue cod are self-medicating with seaweeds. And blue cod typically eat fish, shellfish, worms and crabs, but Lindsay sometimes finds sea lettuce in their stomachs. He calls them the vegetarian blue cod. So if we're successful with our funding, our next step is to explore what biochemical properties are in the seaweeds that are consumed by blue cod, and could those lead to novel drug targets. So the last behaviour I'd like to explore tonight is cleaning symbiosis. And cleaning symbiosis involves species that communicate and cooperate for mutual benefit. The communication can involve quite elaborate displays or subtle displays, but there's always a component of visual communication and purposeful tactile stimulation. And this interaction facilitates an agreement between the two animals to cooperate. In this case, this is a John Dory with a spider crab, and the spider crab signals the John Dory. It climbs up a brown seaweed and it waves. And the John Dory swims over and tips itself on its side, holds out a fin, and the crab climbs aboard. And you can see in the picture shown here that this John Dory is infected with external sea lice, and the crab will move around and chase the sea lice, they're relatively active, and chase the sea lice around the John Dory and eat them. And when it's finished, the John Dory goes back to the seaweed, drops off the crab, and they're done. So these interactions usually occur at specific locations, as I've mentioned, called cleaning stations. So these are, sort of analogous to a doctor's clinic, and clients will queue to be cleaned. And you can just make out the cleaner there. It's a shrimp, common name of red gloves, palemon. So this is smooth toadfish queuing for cleaning services. Communication and cooperation, as Peter mentioned, are essential. If it's not genuine, the client might eat the cleaner. Or the cleaner can cheat, and instead of removing a parasite, it might take a little chunk of flesh. So cooperation, communication, and science engagement with management authorities and decision makers is key to what we do at Cawthron. We work with the Ministry for Primary Industries at the bench in the development of new diagnostic tools and techniques, and to validate them and ensure uptake so that our science is taken to government and used as part of future diagnostics for disease outbreaks. We bring together local council, DOC, MPI on how to best respond to emerging disease issues in wildlife, such as this emerging viral disease that we've only recently detected in endemic bullies in New Zealand. We work with iwi to co-develop best approaches to work with tonga and endangered species. And I've got a picture here of our mahi with Hokanui Runanga, and a huge shout out to Ricky and Luca who are in the audience tonight. And our work together is providing novel insights into the probable cause of lamprey reddening syndrome, kanakana. And we've learned so much from Hokonui about the cultural significance of this species and also the ecology. And together we've developed a disease investigation that is mindful of both cultural and scientific needs. We also work with the University of Otago on emerging diseases in seabirds, and this work engages mana whenua through the provision of culturally important materials, including bird feathers. This hoiho, shown on the right, or yellow-eyed penguin, died in an animal hospital and was donated for the purpose of our research. There are less than 250 breeding pairs of hoiho on mainland Aotearoa, New Zealand, and 50% of the chicks are succumbing to an emerging respiratory disease. We work with mana whenua to change the way we now conduct necropsies of birds, and we do it in a way that appropriately preserves feathers and pelts. And this led to the support of a weaving wananga, where participants wove pepe kakahu or baby cloaks. So the theme of tonight, how science can help society, but we should also consider how can society help science. We need public engagement in science and in citizen science initiatives. And in terms of aquatic animal health, members of the public are essential to passive surveillance because of the wide reach members of the public can have that even science organisations or government cannot have. So if you see a suspected pest or disease, we really want to hear from you. So please report it if you see something that you're uncertain about. So what you can do is you can take a photo or collect a sample, record the location, which also can be on your phone with your photo. And this is the hotline number to MPI to report suspected pests or disease in New Zealand. You can also, you don't have to call if you feel uncomfortable, you can also lodge just a report through their online portal. So how can science serve society? We are better prepared for emerging diseases. We can make informed decisions. We have new tools at our fingertips, and we can make major knowledge gains. We can repair the environment, but most importantly, by working together as a community, we can inform national decisions that support our thriving industries and our beautiful environments in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and our natural resources. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you.